What do you think of what happened in Boston? When we were looking for a pressure cooker and 2 teenagers, you know, and then they took over the whole city and shut it down. And to me, that looked a whole lot like martial law.
Yeah. Oh, God, I can't believe. See, this is why I didn't want to give this talk, because I knew that we'd have this conversation. And now it's on the record. All right. Let me take a step back. And we have to deal with it. Let me take a step back and a deep breath, because this is a very painful thing to talk about. So all over the world, we know, it's well established, the State Department and intelligence agencies engage in theater, and it's what they do, it's spycraft, to create spectacles and events that people may not realize are spectacles and events, but that, well, like the overthrow of Mossadegh in the 50s in Iran. They'll funnel money to protesters, they'll, fly people in to infiltrate protesters, they'll create fake newspapers, and so on. So we know that this happens in countries around the world. I believe that a law has been passed in the United States, I think it's part of the Defense Authorization Act, I need to confirm this, that, now makes it legal to propagandize American citizens. Do we know about that? Yeah, it's true. And is it in the NDAA or is it in something else? Do we know? It's a separate bill. It's a separate bill. And it's been passed. It's now law? Do we know what 2 years ago. Do we know what the name of it is?
I don't remember, but I reported on it.
Oh, thank you. Will you send me the link?
Yeah.
Thank you. So what this means is, and as a journalist to say these words, I can't tell you with what a heavy heart I say them, but we've entered an era in which it is not crazy to assess news events to see if they're real or not real. And in the United States as well as overseas. And in fact, it's kind of crazy not to. Now, there's so much hype about what I just said, and so I want to be very clear about it so it can't be taken out of context. There's this kind of reflexive vilification of anyone speculating about that because they become a conspiracy theorist, right? Well, just bear with me. I've often thought about this because our intelligence agencies, I respect spies. Who are doing, before it got out of control, I believe we need intelligence. I believe we need intelligence agencies. I don't think there's anything dishonorable about being in the intelligence services if you obey the Constitution and the law. But all over the world, our intelligence services are engaged in conspiring to create outcomes. That's their job. That's how they're successful. So now that it's illegal to propagandize in the United States, it doesn't surprise me that there's more and more products coming up in popular culture, more and more events in the news stream that seem to be, to my eye, to be subsidized. Let me give you some examples of that. I'm not talking about Boston right now. I'll get to that. We also talked earlier about infiltrators, right? And how they provoke violence. This is well established. So if we know that infiltrators by the police, NYPD, they've been documented, or other police forces, dress up like people they're not and provoke violence, why is it unthinkable that there might be spectacles that might drive an outcome in the news stream? Let me give you a couple of quick examples. And all I'm saying is we, unfortunately, and I have to say this to my fellow journalists as well, we've entered a time in which we need to be very skeptical about the news stream and look at it critically and ask for more verification and more inquiry. And that's just being good reporters. And it makes it like this. There's spectacle fed into the news media in China. There's spectacle fed into, like Chile. How did Pinochet, engage in his coup? He created photographs of a cache of weapons that the terrorists had, hidden. Was it real? Was it not? Most historians think it wasn't. I mean, this is like not unusual, in the process of creating a closed society. So, if laws have made it legal to assassinate American citizens and legal to propagandize them, why should it be crazy or weird to think that might be for a reason, right? All right. I saw the movie Zero Dark 30, thank you very much. And I have worked on 2 presidential campaigns, so I recognize political talking points. And I wrote a piece saying, this reads like the Pentagon signed off on the script. Because there were like chunks of political talking points identifiable to anyone who's worked in Washington, right? And you don't come up with those if you're a writer writing a screenplay. And everyone was very upset. It was very controversial and scandalous. But in fact, belatedly, a news story came out saying that in fact the Pentagon had, I think, subsidized some of it, but had certainly consulted directly on the script. And I see more and more TV shows about the CIA and more TV shows about spies and gigantic blockbusters in which surveillance is normalized and gigantic blockbusters in which people are tortured to get them to talk in a way that might exonerate people who actually tortured people to get them to talk in Guantanamo. And there's all this money being pumped into these unaccountable, terrorism fighting things. And now there's no law preventing that money from going through front organizations right into popular culture. So that's of interest to me. And so another thing I want to say, and there's so many people waiting to ask a question, but I just need to say this, is I'm skeptical of certain news events that seem more theatrical than the norm, or I want to ask questions about them. Because I was in CNN once recently, and they were reporting a story about a water skier who had been decapitated on a lake between Mexico and the United States, and it had something to do with a terrorism threat. Right? And I was like, decapitated water skier. Sometimes you hear these things and it's like so novelistic. You're like, real life doesn't work that way. Like these are so novelistic. Someone's coming up with it to make it stick in the popular imagination. Or it just makes you think, well, I'd like to document that. I'm a reporter. What's the source? And it kept being just this one guy, Judge Arpajo in Texas. I may be mispronouncing his name. He's a very, yes. He was the source, he was the source, he was the source. And I have this wonderful Facebook community all over the world. And I went on Facebook and I'm like, Mexican Facebook community, is there any reporting about a beheaded water skier in this lake, in this place in Mexico? And they're like, no, what are you talking about? There's nothing like that. Doesn't exist. So I turned to the CNN producer and said, do you have a second source for this story? And it was all over the news, all over the news, all over the news. And they're like, and they checked and it's like, nope, just this guy, Judge, whatever. And I'm like, well, can you find a second source? And they were blushing and embarrassed, and they looked and they confessed that they didn't have a second source, which if you know what journalism is, you're supposed to confirm it with 2 sources. So ever since that experience, CNN is running with this. No one's verifying it. Journalists aren't in a position to follow up on anything anymore because budgets are slashed and there's no investigative reporting. All this nonsense can enter the media stream for purposes that have to do with advancing agendas because no one's checking. That's all I want to say about that.
One of the ways that you can tell what controllers are doing, what the controllers are doing, is by the laws they pass. You can tell what their intentions are, you can tell what their plans for the future are, and you can tell what they're doing now. Now, in 2013, this was something that they tried to enact in 2012, and it's called the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012. Here is the original law. Now, I'm going to tell you why this is important in terms of all these crisis-acted events in a second. But they tried to push it through in May 10th of 2012, but was enacted into law, I believe, on July 5th of 2013. And it's a bill to amend the United States Information and Educational Exchange Act of 1948 to authorize the domestic dissemination of information and material about the United States intended primarily for foreign audiences and for other purposes. So the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948 was known as an Anti-Propaganda Act. So they are basically amending, they are amending an Anti-Propaganda Act. Now this was covered by the alternative media and to some extent the national media and the international media. But basically, this is them setting up the right to propagandize the American citizens as well as the international community. And I'll get into how they do this in just a moment. But the reason why they passed this, or tried to pass this in 2012, well, we know when Sandy Hook took place in December of 2012, and all of these stage type events. And all of these things are covered under this act. So they made it legal to do these things. So this is basically tipping their hand. We can see what they were intending to do because they have passed this law, and now they're using this law to do those things. All right, so here it is. This is the first part where they're amending the law. Section 501. The Secretary and the Broadcasting Board of Governors are authorized to use funds appropriated or otherwise made available for public diplomacy information programs to provide for the preparation, dissemination, and use of information intended for foreign audiences abroad about the United States, its people, and its policies through press, publications, radio, motion pictures, the internet, and other information media, including social media, and through information centers, instructors, and other direct or indirect means of communication. So here it is. They are able to make movies. They are able to make shows. They are able to produce news. Any number of these things would include Sandy Hook. It would include the Roanoke shooting. It would include the Oregon shooting. All of these things could be construed as media preparation. You could say, well, it's a movie. We're just making a mockumentary. It's a fake documentary. We're making a movie. This is a movie. This is a TV show. This is a television show we're making. It's a series. And we're using the news to make it dramatic. So they have legalized all of these types of things. And it says here it's for dissemination for foreign audiences. But that's simply not the case, because later on in this bill, in this law, it says this. The rule of construction. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit the Department or State or the Broadcasting Board of Governors from engaging in any medium or form of communication, either directly or indirectly, because a United States domestic audience is or may thereby be exposed to program material or based on a presumption of such exposure. Such material may be made available within the United States and disseminated when appropriate pursuant to sections 502 and 1005 from the original act that they're amending here. So they're saying, well, you know, if American people are going to come across this information anyway, you might as well just be allowed to do it in the United States. So initially, in the beginning of the law, they're saying this is for a foreign audience. But now in this section, they're saying, well, they're going to get exposed to this anyway, so go ahead and do that. So they're basically making this a domestic law where they can produce productions like Sandy Hook, like the Boston bombing, any of these motion pictures, any of these fraudulent events. And it says here, when appropriate, pursuant to sections 502 or 1005. So let's take a look at that. Now, Section 502 says, nothing in this act shall be construed to give the Department a monopoly in the production or sponsorship on the air or shortwave radio broadcast programs, or a monopoly in any other medium of information. So they're saying they can't form a United States press, like they would own all the networks. That CBS, NBC, and all these types of networks would still be in private ownership. So they're trying to make it that the United States government doesn't have a monopoly, and that's better for the government. It's better for these propagandizing pieces that they're producing, because privately owned businesses producing these makes it a lot more believable than state-run media. You see this. So when they're talking about China or Russia having state-run media, they say, well, that's just coming from the government. But now they're able to produce these things. So that's not a problem having that section be honored, because that section actually helps. And this part also talks about this. This is section 1005. In carrying out the provisions of this act, it shall be the duty of the Secretary to utilize to the maximum extent practicable the services and facilities of private agencies, including existing American press, publishing, radio, motion pictures, and other agencies. So this was originally constructed, this part of this original law, to say the government can't have its own media. And so you have to you have to give your information for dissemination to private media agencies. And if you give them this media, then they can report it with their perspective. So it takes it away from the government. This was an anti-propaganda act. So now they're saying, well, these two provisions have to be honored, but they've made it legal to produce propagandized acts, and now we have basically a fascist government where the corporations and the government are all together, the media and the government are all together, and they're one unit. So all of these provisions now in the original act are going to help them propagandize the American people. So what they're basically saying here is, now you have the right to produce whatever kind of media you want, and it can be true, it could be fictional, it could be anything, to propagandize the American people and people abroad, and you can turn it over to the private networks and they can run it, and it's all legal. So this makes Sandy Hook, this makes all these types of things legally produced Hollywood productions that the American people think are real and the people in the world think are real. So think about this. Why would they do this? Why would they pass this law if they weren't going to use it? And now we see all these crisis actors. We saw these propagandizing pieces, and they've emerged as something that they are doing on a regular basis. And they all came when they were trying to pass this law and after they've passed this law. So you can see this. I've made a recent video about how our laws are basically being written by Hollywood, our social policies, what we're allowed to say and what we're not, whether it's Hollywood-produced movies. Now, a lot of these Hollywood-produced movies that are pro-spy, that are pro any of these types of government actions. I think the name of the movie was Zero Dark 40 or something like that. I think it won an Academy Award. And it was basically propagandizing that whole fake thing that happened when they killed bin Laden. And you see government talking points, political talking points, showing up in all of these spy movies, all of these war movies that they make. They're putting it out there. That is propaganda. So there's propaganda within our films, and there's propaganda in make-believe life, and then in reality TV programs, and then these fake news stories, these fake these real-looking events to most people that have been faked and have been staged and been crisis acted, and these are all legal. So then you have to ask yourself, if you're a person that thinks, well, these things can't be real, because why would the government do it? Well, why would they make it legal to do it if they weren't going to do it? Why would they repeal an act, an ancient act from over 60 years ago that was put in place as an anti-communist act and an anti-government act, and now they're repealing this so many years later, and they're pushing all these bizarre agendas through the media and through movies and television programs and all these types of things. So there's no reason for anyone to believe they wouldn't use this. Why would they go through the trouble of passing a law that they weren't going to use?